Good evening, everybody. That's okay. Welcome to another episode of The Brunt of It. I'm recording in the evening after my children have hit the rack. Which is always an event in my family to get them to calm down enough to, go to sleep. Whiskey helps. I'm just kidding. We don't use whiskey. Well, for me, we do, but not for anybody else except for me and myself and sometimes I. Anyway, welcome to The Brunt of It. If you are going to outsource your thinking, why not do it with somebody you trust? If you're not going to outsource your thinking, then maybe I can point you in some directions that might help you out to get a more well-rounded view and to equip you with grown-up conversations, the ability to think as a grown-up and not a fifth grade bully recess shouting match. Isn't that kind of what the political scene is right now, where both sides are really upset and angry and highly emotional and you this and you that, and it reminds me of fifth grade when I used to play recess and we'd get in, shouting matches at recess. It's just, ugh. Why not talk like grown-ups and just, listen with respect, have some sort of civil discourse, which is weird that there's like this new axis of nice that is becoming niche. It's kind of weird, isn't it? I mean, if you think about it, we should do better at that as a society, perhaps, and maybe we can do our part through this live stream to be better. I hope you will join me in that endeavor. I can help point you in the direction. I can increase your awareness. I can serve as an aggregator of information for you and basically help build discernment, wisdom, control your emotions so that you can think more clearly about things. And we got a lot of stuff today. We're going to talk about some updates on improvements. We're going to talk about sticky narratives and some political stuff, some COVID stuff. We got a whole bunch to get to, so let's dive right in. All right. Before I dive in, I want to just briefly give you a little bit of background if this is the first time you're seeing this. So I've had 20 years of experience in not just the private sector with small business, but also in grad school and academia, in the military. I've been affiliated for 20 years with the military. I had a startup for a while. I worked in a political campaign for a while. And I was a starving actor in Los Angeles as well. I've got an engineering degree from Northwestern, and I've got a public policy degree from Harvard. I've lived in 8 different states. I've worked in 12 different states. So my experience is very diverse. I've been exposed to a lot of different cultures across the country, and I've worked in a lot of different spaces and dealt with creative people, technical people, geeks and nerds, which is my major in college, and also artsy, head in the sky kind of people in Los Angeles and other places. So that's a little bit about me. I feel like that diversity of experience can offer some perspectives that maybe can help with all that exposure, help you to process the information coming in. We kind of live in this fog of war, don't we, going through life? And this fog of war consists of all this conflicting and contradictory information that's out there coming in and feeding us, whether it's philosophical information, political information, religious information, any kind of information. And you got to kind of sort through, what's right and what's wrong. And I aim to help you do that. I aim to give you some tools to help ground you and build discernment about what information you can interrogate in what way, to make sure it's building you up and not tearing you down or trying to make you believe something that the writer is or speaker is trying to make you believe. So hopefully we can build some discernment together. I'm big on 1% improvements. You'll hear me talk about this almost every episode and every show. I've been talking about it. If you look at my back catalog, I've been talking about it almost every day. What I mean by that is anything you're endeavoring to do, whether it's leadership management or learn a new skill in this COVID, stay at home, cooking, reading, learning a new skill, tackle it, and 1% incremental improvements. And if you know anything about compounding interest with money, those 1% incremental improvements will start to compound over time. And after a year of incremental improvements, that's 365 days, each day just improving by 1%, all of a sudden you're 30 times better at the end of the year than you started. So that's a powerful way to approach life, I would encourage you to do it. And don't worry about taking 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Don't worry about backtracking. Just commit to the process of 1% improvements. So whatever happens yesterday, wake up the next day, wake up in the morning, and be ready to make that improvement. And it could be just subtle, just something, just one small victory to show you that improvement. So in my case for this podcast, this live stream, this is one of my projects for COVID stay at home, and I'm trying to build my process out and get more efficient with how I'm taking notes, how I'm capturing information throughout my day, because the news is 24 hours. It's constantly coming. You get updates. I'm on Twitter quite a bit. I have lots of interesting dialogues on that platform. So I get information on Twitter, and I'm trying to capture the information and the ideas in real time over a long period of time. So it's little, 2, 3 minute, 10-minute clips, but I'm trying to make sure I catalog it and organize it in such a way that might be helpful and useful to the audience. So tell me how I'm doing. I'm trying to get better at that and start to build in some really interesting big picture type stuff in each episode that I hope you guys like. So that's my live stream prep. I'm starting to change how I do my links and how I do my sources and my notes. And at some point I might post my notes. I'm not sure. That's really, so far it's just been for my prep, and I usually have way more material than I can talk about. So that's a good problem to have. I think this is what, episode 27. So that's pretty good. I'm coming up on a next milestone, which is 30 in a couple days, and that's very, very exciting. So let's dive into the next improvement, which I wanted to learn day trading. So I opened up a fake account, not a fake account, but a simulated account with TD Ameritrade's Thinkorswim platform. And they give you $200,000 of monopoly money to play around in the stock market and make trades. And so I've been doing that for the last 4 weeks, and it's been really, really fun and interesting. And it's teaching me about my own emotional state. It's teaching me about the stock market as a mirror of society's emotional state and overreactions. So every reaction is an overreaction in the stock market if you start to learn the trends. And I was talking to somebody this morning about, what do I do? How do I, what techniques do I use to actually take positions? And I want to start by saying, don't take advice from a simulation trader who has 4 weeks of experience. Just don't do it. But I just thought I'd offer that is my experience, some tips that I picked up. First of all, there's a whole bunch of YouTubers out there you can follow to learn what they do. And I would encourage you, if you start to learn about this process, day trading or swing trading, to listen to a bunch of different voices to see what their techniques are. And don't entirely go down one path and follow one person is my recommendation. I would say, broaden it out, maybe 4 or 5 different people that you listen to and kind of learn their techniques. And then as you do it, you're going to start to develop your own technique, something you're comfortable with. And the best piece of advice I got out of some YouTubers was, don't trade something that you don't understand. So have a sense that you understand what's going on before you trade it. So that's the first thing. The first thing to really know. And as far as my process, what I did is I started to just kind of look at patterns over time, observe what the price would do over the course of a day or over the course of a week. And if you do this, you'll start to see things that will jump out of you. For example, in off-hour trading, as the off-hour trading happens, not when the market's open, and you'll see that where the price goes in the off-market hours, and you can kind of anticipate what's going to happen when the market opens. And in many cases, if the off-market hours, the price is rising from what it closed at the day before, then the market will open and that stock will correct back down in price, and then it'll stop and then it'll come back up. And sometimes it'll come back up past the opening price. So I look for that V-shaped curve in the first 30 minutes to 2 hours of the market open, and I've made some decent gains on that. And this morning I woke up after the stock market opened. So I woke up around 4:30 when my daughter woke up. So I kind of overslept a little bit, and I'm like, and I jumped on Thinkorswim on my iPhone, started looking around, and I made, I think, 4 or 5 quick buys on various stocks that I saw what I thought were good patterns. And then within about 45 to 60 minutes, I had made a $1,200 gain from those 4 to 5 stocks. And I had one ETF. And people ask me, how do I know the patterns and when it's going to go up to down or down to up? And I have these indicators. I have about 3 or 4 indicators that I look at. And one thing you should know about the stock market and analyzing stock prices and whatnot is there are a gazillion. There are a gazillion analysis tools. There are so many different ways to analyze things, and it can make your head spin. So I don't mess with all the complicated stuff. Maybe someday I'll start to get in, broaden my scope out and learn more about some of the other stuff. I use, simple moving averages. I use the MACD analysis tool, and I use the RSI one. And those are kind of the three that I look at. And I also look at the volume and the price. So the price, I always use candlestick, and I would recommend don't use anything other than candlestick, because you'll see where the bids are, and you'll see the candlestick area will change based on the behavior of the traders. So I always look for multiple indicators to signal that something's going to change. And if I make the wrong decision and I buy thinking it's going to go up and then it goes down instead, then what I might do is wait till it goes down to the next 2 or 3 indicator crossover and buy again. And that way, when it usually will come back up again, not always, I've made some mistakes, then the overall price that you buy the stock at, your position, will start to drop as the stock drops. And then when you go over, when it eventually does turn around and go back up, you can make some pretty solid gains. That's worked in every case except for one. I did that with an ETF during the oil shock last week, and I lost a lot of money. I think I lost like $5,000 on that one stock by trying to buy as the stock was continuing to drop, and it never really bounced back up to any level that I could make a gain. And I had to the other thing I would advise is, if you do have to cut your losses and you're trying to turn day trades into swing trades, which is what I did, where the day trade's not working out, but if you keep the stock for a day or two or 4 or 5 or maybe 2 weeks, then the price might go back up if you look at the historical averages, and you might be able to get gains, just not today, not tomorrow, but maybe next week or next, on Thursday or something. But if you do have to cut your losses on a swing trade scenario, if you can, maybe try to make it on a Friday or maybe the last trading day of the week, because cutting your losses is emotionally painful. Or do it at the end of the day too, because you have a mandatory period where you have to not think about it because the market's not open, unless you're doing after hours trading, which I'm not doing. But on a Friday, so I cut my losses on a Friday, and I had the whole weekend to not really think about it. And then when I came back in on Monday morning and I hit the market fresh, I wasn't even thinking about that loss. I was just like, okay, ground zero, 1% improvements, let's go. And by the way, the 1% improvement I use with stocks. So my anchor point is, if the stock moves up 1% from the purchase price, then I'm looking to sell. And that's kind of what my minimum level of gain that I want. And likewise, if it drops 1%, I'm kind of thinking, well, do I hold on and buy again, or do I sell and cut my losses? And my hope is that my gains of 1% will outpace my losses of 1% or more. Maybe 60% or 70% of the time I have 1% gains. And overall, that's going to add up. That's going to accumulate over time into some decent gains. Like I said, 37 times over the course of a year, if you have those cumulative, that increase in that 1% daily, it's going to lead to 37 times gains at the end of the year. Now, I haven't mentioned this yet, but the reverse is also true. So imagine you decline 1% every day. Okay. Imagine that you kind of let your diet go a little bit more today than you did yesterday. You let your exercise routine go a little bit more today than yesterday. And that continues for months or for a year. Well, if you start at 100% and you decline 1% every day, after 365 days, you are effectively at zero. So this is the power of what's called practical drift in risk literature, aviation risk literature, and it's a powerful concept to get your mind around, because on a personal level, if you're letting something slip in your life, and it doesn't matter what it is, it could be spiritually, it could be professionally, it could be personally, it could be relationally, whatever it is, if it's slipping 1% every day, after about a year, it's zero. So you want to guard against that. You want to have maybe markers in your own life to flag when you might be slipping in something. I'd encourage you to keep it on the positive side, the positive 1%. So that's a little bit about the trading and about this podcast. Hopefully that helps people out there. Another personal update, we at the small business that I help out, I'm in a management position, leadership position. We got the PPP loan, so we're starting to hire people back. I just sent out about 8 or 10 offer letters today to get people back on board. So that's pretty exciting. We got some interesting projects coming up that we're working on. So that's going to affect this live stream. I'm hoping I can work around the hours I'm going to devote back to that job. We'll see how that works. It might mean more recording in the late evenings. It might mean more recording in the mornings and more shows. We'll see how that works out. But that's good news. So I'll have an income again, which is good. Okay, so let's dive into sticky narratives. So I talk a lot about narratives, and basically what I mean by narrative is we all have data points in our life with information. We have a couple data points, interactions with different concepts, different ideas, or people. We have a couple interactions with different people, and we will make a story about that or a narrative about those contact points. And that narrative can be very sticky, and it could be an error because you have, just a few data points. It could be 2, it could be 20 over, 3 months or something. But you have enough data points where you feel comfortable making that narrative string. And in the process of doing that, you are, whether you know it or not, you're excluding data points that you haven't observed and you're not aware of that could change your narrative. They could change how you think about the topic or the issue or the person. And if you're a business manager person, and in my background, I've managed up to 280 people before in various capacities. I've had a number of direct reports during the last 7 years. And I think I've hired about maybe 20 or 30 people in various capacities. And I've recruited about 15 people into the reserves with the military. So I've had a lot of recruiting experience, a lot of hiring experience, and a lot of management experience with people and with middle managers between me and the frontline staff. Excuse me. So one thing you'll notice is that this narrative thing is helpful to explain why somebody that you work with may have a negative opinion about somebody else you work with, because their data, their interactions might be less frequent than yours, and they also might be different than yours. And so they're stringing that narrative about those interactions, and maybe that narrative results in conflict between those two individuals. And you're looking at it from a third party vantage point, and you don't really understand why the conflict is happening in the first place. And you know that this person's narrative that's negative about this other person doesn't match your narrative because you have different data points. And so each of you is kind of isolating data that might be relevant to how you feel about a topic. And being able to step outside of your own narrative is a very difficult thing. It's very difficult, as the literature will show. So there's an article in Scientific American that just came out that talks about liberals and conservatives are both susceptible to fake news, but for different reasons. So there's this anchoring effect. This goes back to the anchoring effect with our narratives, that we reject outside data. And in this particular Scientific American article, I got to cue it up. So this, are liberals and conservatives equally susceptible to fake news, is the question that the researchers ask. The answer is yes. The researchers found that people on both sides of the traditional left-right divide are equally likely to believe political news that is consistent with their ideology and to disbelieve news that is inconsistent with their side. For instance, liberals judged the anti-Trump story as being much more legitimate than the pro-Trump story, and conservatives showing the opposite judgment, with conservatives showing the opposite judgment. So that's an interesting thing that just came out. It's not a surprise. This is just academics saying kind of some stuff that I've been discussing for a while. So now they looked at why and different thinking styles of the right and the left. And this is kind of interesting. So the researchers measured individual differences in thinking styles and found that regardless of the political party identification, when high need of cognitive individuals were presented with fake news stories that were consistent with their ideology, they were even more likely than everyone else to judge the story as legitimate. And when they were faced with fake news story that were inconsistent with their ideology, they were even less likely to consider the news legitimate than everyone else. So this is an interesting finding, which suggests that the more cognitive, the more thinking you consider yourself, perhaps, or maybe that you are, maybe, the higher test scores you got, or the higher, reasoning faculties that you may possess, or, thinking through high need of for cognition individuals, then, highly logical, highly rational people, they are more likely to believe stories that back up their prior beliefs, and they're less likely to accept opposing viewpoints. And that's an interesting finding. You would almost think that it would be the opposite. So one possible explanation is that highly logical and rational people are not only more likely to disbelieve politically inconsistent news stories along tribal lines, but they are also more likely to seek out further disconfirming information, thus exaggerating their disbelief of politically inconsistent stories. So what they're saying is if you have a highly logical and rational mind, you're going to hear something that kind of challenges your narrative, and not only are you going to kind of push back and reject that, you're going to actually go out deliberately and look for information that confirms your position. So that's one possible explanation for why people show this trend. And if you are therefore, if you're less rational, less logical, and maybe you are more like gut feeling person or on your emotions, then maybe you're less likely to do that. You're less likely to go out and get information that reinforces your prior beliefs. So that was really interesting, and it kind of led me down a rabbit hole because it linked to two other articles in this study, one from Science Direct, and the title of this article, which was written a couple of years back in 2017, says, "Liberals and conservatives are similarly motivated to avoid exposure to one another's opinions." And what was interesting about this is the finding was that the reason to avoid exposure to one another's opinions was not due to already being informed. Okay, it wasn't due to already being informed about the opposing point of view. More so, what these researchers found was that it was explained as more anticipation of cognitive dissonance or potential harm to relationships. So, in other words, people would avoid exposure to one another's views because their chief concern was cognitive dissonance and harm to relationships. And it wasn't necessarily how much they were informed on the other side. So that's really interesting. The relationships is a big piece. I mean, you could imagine, you probably have friends or family members that 2016 really split people one way or the other. I mean, they were here or they were there, and that was it. And I had a relationship like that with a friend of mine from high school, he and I were politically aligned for 30 plus years. And then all of a sudden this 2016 election happens and he and I diverged. And now we are completely on opposite sides in many issues. And it's very emotional. And so, engaging with him has been a challenge, to engage with somebody who's highly passionate and highly emotional. And this goes both ways. I mean, my father was like this on the right when I was in grad school, and I was learning all this information that was updating my narrative, because sometimes you're in environments where you just can't help but update it. And he wasn't exposed to that information. So he was still very, very locked into his prior positions. And I was trying to offer information that he may not be aware of. And he was highly resistant. And that led to some interesting discussions between he and I, about 10 years ago. So anyway, that was one story, and that liberals and conservatives are similarly motivated to avoid exposure. And yeah, people anticipated that cross-cutting information would produce cognitive dissonance and harm relationships. So that's what the finding of that was. And then there was a second article that I found in Sage Journals. This one was also written in 2017. And I'm just going to read this abstract. The title is "Science Denial Across the Political Divide. Liberals and conservatives are similarly motivated to deny attitude-inconsistent science." So I found this one really interesting because it stuck out, both sides accusing the other side of being science deniers. And in the case of COVID, that's very apparent with people who want to go back to work, and then a finger pointing saying, "You're not listening to the scientists." And then on the other side saying, "No, you're not listening to the antibody tests should be updating our awareness about this disease, and you should be looking to reopen just like the rest of us." So that's kind of going both directions right now, interestingly. And you can find experts that fall out on both sides. And I've actually covered experts on both sides in this show in episodes past. So I want to read this abstract. We tested whether conservatives and liberals are similarly or differentially likely to deny scientific claims that conflict with their preferred conclusions. Participants were randomly assigned to read about a study with correct results that were either consistent or inconsistent with their attitudes about one or several issues. For example, carbon emissions. Participants were asked to interpret numerical results and decide what the study concluded. After being informed of the correct interpretation, participants rated how much they agreed with, found knowledgeable, and trusted the researcher's correct interpretation. Both liberal and conservatives engaged in motivated interpretation of study results and denied the correct interpretation of those results when the interpretation conflicted with their attitudes. Our study suggests the same motivational processes underlie differences in the political priorities of those on the left and the right. So this basically cuts both ways. And I thought of two examples today that would be helpful in issues that are kind of in public discourse. One is climate change. So the big criticism and critique from the left on the right is that, you're a denier, you're a climate denier, and you're denying science, you're denying the data and whatnot. Now, it's an interesting critique because it's partially perhaps correct that there is an ignoring that happens on the right of some of the data. Now, I have covered why modeling, we should be very, very skeptical of modeling, and specifically the IPCC models. I covered that in an issue, in a show a while back, that we have reason to believe that models are imperfect because almost every model is imperfect. Some are helpful, and there's a famous quote that came out from a famous statistician that says, all models are wrong, some are helpful, or some are useful, something like that. So we've seen that with this COVID modeling, both in the UK and the University of Washington, where the modeling is only as good as the assumptions made, and the actual numbers that pan out on the ground are not consistent with the modeling predictions. So you have this feedback loop into the model to try to make it better, which some of these models are doing. And now that we have the antibody tests, we're getting more information about our assumptions. So that's, climate change on the left, that'd be their big critique. And then on the right, the big critique, I think that's kind of evolved kind of recently, is pro-life, right? So the right would say of the left, you are ignoring science-based conclusions about when life begins, and therefore you are kind of crowding out that information because it's going to conflict with your desire to keep, abortion. So that would be the critique on the other side. And I talked a little bit about the abortion issue a few days ago when I put it in the context of China and the one-child policy. Sorry, China and the one-child policy. So the one-child policy happened for about 30 years. It just ended a few years ago. And during that one-child policy, many may not be aware of this, but there were an estimated 30 million more boys born than girls. And one reason was because of gender-specific abortions. So if you learned that you were going to have a girl, you were more likely to abort that girl and wait for the next pregnancy to see if you'd have a boy. And I was asking the audience to just wrestle with this idea. And did this feel right? Was this something that sat right with us ethically and morally? And I kind of pose it as a hypothetical question because it raises some ethical hairs, perhaps, about how we feel about abortion. So anyway, that's an example about science. I'm not going to talk more about abortion. You can go get triggered if you want. So I thought one signal to us that we can maybe know that we're open to kind of that pushing against our own narrative. And I think this is a good signal, and I want to kind of play this idea out, but it's the idea of humor. So if we can poke fun at our own position, we can poke fun at ourselves and not take our own positions too seriously. I mean, we have to take them seriously, no doubt, because we make commitments around them. But if we're able to poke fun, then I think that's probably an indicator that we're okay. On the flip side, if we take humor and turn it into something that's mean, or if we look at humor from the other side that's supposed to be lighthearted, and we start to make it into something that is should be banned or should be somebody should get fired over, then I think we're starting to see where that anchoring narrative is really inflexible, in my view. So I'm playing with this idea. Let me know what you guys think of it. But so humor. I wanted to talk about some humor that has come out, and it's such a powerful tool. And two recent examples: Dave Chappelle had his Netflix special, I think last year, and it was very politically incorrect, and he got a lot of flack on the left for this special, and it was hilarious. He did a bit on abortion, he did a bit on a bunch of stuff, and it was just a really, really funny set. And he wasn't, you couldn't tell in the humor if he was really hardcore one way or hardcore the other way. And he left it ambiguous, I think on purpose, because he was trying to show that both sides should be able to laugh at these kinds of things. Bill Maher's another good humorist, I think, even though I disagree with him on policy almost on everything, with the exception of a few things. But he's a big free speech guy and uses humor, so I like his humor, even though I disagree with him. And what's amazing in today's world with Twitter and the social media is the memes that get produced. I mean, there are some really, really funny memes. And hopefully this doesn't upset anybody, but there's a meme that went around last night that there's been two memes that have made me cry, okay, in the last 2-3 weeks. And I'll cover the non-confrontational one, the one that maybe a few people would take issue with just because it's poking fun at people who trip and, bump their head. But it's the opening shot is this woman who gets out of a hot tub and she slips and smashes her face into the side of the hot tub. And then it repeats that short clip and you hear the sound, and then it becomes a beat. And then and the meme transfers into a song, and it transitions between a couple songs, and it's all these bloopers of people, hitting their head on a table, on a car, slipping, and it is really funny, and it made me cry. It was so funny, and it's a short clip. It's maybe less a minute or something, or a minute and a half. So that was a couple weeks ago, and then there's two last night that. One made me cry, and one I thought was just so apt. I made this analogy a few days ago, well, maybe a few weeks ago now on Twitter. I said, if President Trump delivered a baby in the lobby of Trump Tower, delivered a baby by himself from a homeless woman on the street, then half the country would figure out a way to find an issue with how he did it and criticize him for doing it the way he did it. So there's a meme that came out that was basically a similar theme, and it said, on the top of the meme, and a meme could be a picture or it could be a video, it could be an art, piece of art. So it's almost like political cartooning. It's very, very similar. But on the top it was Trump, and it said, "Trump pro oxygen," and then underneath was a picture with a guy with and the caption said, "Liberals." Just said liberals, and it was a guy with a plastic bag over his head trying to suffocate himself. And I thought that was just the perfect meme for the state of political discourse in today's world. It was just so funny. And then the other meme, I've been saying that Biden has two critical flaws in my view, and my prediction is he will not be the nominee because of these two critical flaws. The first one is kind of everybody's starting to pick up on it if you've seen him in interviews, and that's this cognitive decline and tripping over his words and just getting confused and not being able to articulate himself as well as he might have in the past. And this is an observation. We don't really know what's going on in his mind and any kind of degradation that's happening, but this is an observation, and I think that the Democrats are going to see that putting him up on a debate stage is going to be brutal. It's going to be brutal against Trump. So that's his fatal flaw number one. Fatal flaw number two is Tara Reade, and I'll cover some of that in a bit. And that's this credible sexual allegation against him. But there was a meme that went around that was that was him in his basement in one of these interviews, and it superimposed around his mouth a tongue that was just kind of lingering in space. And I'll try to reenact it. So if you're watching this on YouTube, you can see it. And it was just like, and it was just, and it was like when his wife was with him on an interview, and she was saying, trying to promote Joe Biden as the next president of the United States. and he's got this look with his tongue moving around in his mouth, and it just looks like a guy who just doesn't know what's going on, and it's so funny. And I know that it's probably it might be a little bit mean, and I know some people would take offense to it, but it literally made me cry. It was so funny. So humor can be misrepresented. And sadly, today there's a commentary in the Wall Street Journal about this, and the title is "How My Joke on Twitter Became a Federal Case." Okay, and this is where things go wrong. I'm going to read a little bit about it so you can kind of figure out what happened. I'm under federal investigation for making a joke on Twitter, and this is written by a guy named Dominic, who is we'll find out is the head of the Federalist, the publisher of the Federalist. Okay, I'm under federal investigation for making a joke on Twitter. On June 2019, employees at the left liberal Vox Media Inc. walked off the job demanding a new collective bargaining agreement. As a publisher of a conservative website, the Federalist, I found the clash ironic. I tweeted, quote, FYI, at Federalist, first one of you tries to unionize, I swear I'll send you back to the salt mine, end quote. Although Twitter leftists were enraged, my employers were amused. They joked about selling branded salt shakers and writing sympathetic vignettes about Union rebels from Federalist salt mines. Then things took an unfunny turn. The National Labor Relations Board informed me that the leftist writer Matt Brunig had filed a formal complaint about my tweet. He withdrew it, but Joel Fleming, a Massachusetts lawyer, filed another. Mr. Fleming alleged I had violated Section 8 Alpha 1 of the Wagner Act, which states that, quote, it shall be an unfair labor practice for an employer to interfere with, restrain, or coerce employees in the exercise of the rights guaranteed in Section 7, namely the rights to self-organize, to form, join, or assist labor organizations, to bargain collectively through representatives of their own choosing, and to engage in other concerted activities for the purpose of collective bargaining or other mutual aid or protection. The accusation was laughable. No employee had expressed a desire to unionize. If anyone had, my joke wouldn't have stood in the way. Mr. Fleming was an interloper anyway. He had no association with the Federalist, but according to the NLRB, anyone can file such a complaint against any company. The NLRB proceeded to invade our publication, heedless of the freedom of the press. Members of my staff were subpoenaed to testify in New York, where none of them lived, and we had no office. The NLRB attempted to subpoena all emails and communications between staff members going back years, including about editorial decisions, hiring decisions, and confidential sources during our coverage of the Russia collusion hoax. Help arrived in the form of the New Civil Liberties Alliance, a nonprofit set up by legal scholar Philip Hamburger that defends constitutional rights against overreach by the administrative state. So I'm not going to go on, but that's really, when you're trying to shut down and subpoena people for a joke, I think that's a signal that you are way too locked in your narrative and way taking yourself too seriously. And this would go back to some of that data to suggest that when you're locked in that side, you are isolating yourself or insulating or rejecting information that might cut against that narrative. So in this case, no, it's not a joke. It's a very serious threat. And maybe this is a bully tactic. Maybe this is a war tactic to try to take down an opposing point of view. It's not clear, but this is, your worldview has to be such that you are in favor with a wartime tactic to take down an opposing point of view, such as this NLRB complaint and pulling the Federalists into court and whatnot. So that's where it can go too far. Moving on. The Navy declassified some footage in 2004 and 2015 of UFOs. So that happened, as reported by ABC News. I have some background with this because I watched the Joe Rogan interview about a year ago. It was less than a year ago, I think. And it was interviewing a commander, a Navy commander. He was actually a squadron commander on an aircraft carrier. And this video was leaked to the New York Times, and the New York Times reported it. And then this commander was interviewed on Joe Rogan. The name of the commander escapes me. I should have written it down before this show. But so he was interviewed by Joe Rogan, and it's a really, really interesting interview. And so I know F-18 pilots personally, and it's a small community in the military. The F-18 community and any aviation community, especially in the Marine Corps and the Navy, it's kind of a small community because everybody knows everybody else, or 1 degree of separation, maybe 2 degrees. And so one of the F-18 pilots I know would have been flying at about this time, and I'm not sure if he was East Coast or West Coast, but he would have been flying. This is off the coast of San Diego, a little bit south, out to sea. And the commander called it a tic tac, and you can see the video, ABC News. It's all over the media. And so when I heard Joe Rogan, I actually reached out to this F-18 pilot in a kind of a group text format, and I kind of joked and I said, "You F-18 guys see some wacky stuff," and I linked the Joe Rogan interview. And it didn't even take him 30 seconds to respond. He said, "I originally heard that story in 2005. In fact, that story and other stories are common knowledge among almost every single F-18 pilot in the Navy and the Marine Corps." And I was like, what? And then he went on to say that he personally knew some of the pilots in that squadron on that aircraft carrier in 2004. So that's how close the connection was for me. What I didn't know was that there's a 2015 video that also came out in the release. So this is really, really interesting stuff. And I've looked through sensors before. I'm familiar with the symbology of sensors, Navy weapons, Navy jet sensors and helicopter sensors. So all the data on there is what I would expect to see a sensor display. And the way in which the operator is using it, the WISO in this case, the way in which they're manipulating the sensor and trying to track this object is fascinating. So that's fun. That's out there. Who knows? Who knows? And apparently the Blink-182 guy got this released. I think on his Twitter, he was taking credit for the negotiation with DOD to get this thing released, which is pretty amazing. A musician was able to do that. All right, enough on that. So go look that up. It's very interesting. COVID-19 updates. A little positive news. There's an Oxford study showing that that a vaccine has been shown to be effective in monkeys, as reported by the New York Times. So they're trying to accelerate those tests and maybe get it into human trials. I don't know if they're close to that yet, but that's at least a sign of good news. And then CNN had a piece on antibody test problems. And I reported this yesterday that the New York Times had a similar piece that looked at the 14 antibody tests out there and found really only 2 that were above 99% positive rate. And the other ones were somewhere in the neighborhood of 95 to 90. And then there was a couple that were down to about 84% effectiveness, like 89 to 84, somewhere around there. And that's with regards to giving false positives or false negatives. I can't remember which one. So the critique is that we can't trust these antibody tests to tell us what the infection rate is. So what's interesting about this is when you dig in the article, it would be interesting to know which antibody tests that have been conducted, whether it's in Santa Clara or in LA or in New York City or in Miami or in Washington State or overseas in different areas. It would be interesting to know if those particular antibody studies, which antibody test did they use? Because the connection's not made. It's not made that the 84% or 85% effective antibody test was used in Santa Clara. It's also not made that the 99% effective test was used in Santa Clara. And maybe they don't know, but that's the missing link. And so you can't really draw a distinction about these antibody tests unless you know which of the 14 tests they used. And that information seems to have been missing. I hope it comes out because that would help us out. But as I've covered, the antibody tests seem to be updating our assumptions about infection, meaning that the infection mortality rate suggests it's below 1% and quite a bit below 1%, anywhere from 0.1 all the way up to about 0.6, 0.75 perhaps. So that's a lot less than the 3 to 6% mortality rate that we were first seeing in the news. And to be fair, that was the case mortality rate. That's the ones who came in and were diagnosed with this disease through testing. And so what we didn't know is the asymptomatics. We didn't know what the number was outside the cases known who had the infection. And what these antibody tests are suggesting is that the infection rate is much higher than we initially thought. In some cases, 10 times or more of what the caseload suggests. So we're seeing orders of magnitude less in the lethality rate. And the comparison to the flu, this actually was helpful. The CNN article was helpful because the case mortality rate for the flu, now the case fatality rate, not the infection mortality rate, the case fatality rate is 0.1%. So if you're going to compare case to case, then you would compare 0.1 to, let's say, 3% or 1.8%, like here in Hawaii. I think it's under 2 still. If you're going to compare infection to infection rate, then let's say the infection rate is 0.5 and the flu infection rate is perhaps as low as 0.05 or thereabouts. So it could be an order of magnitude higher than the seasonal flu. So that's where it looks right now. Now, more information should be coming about this, but that's okay news. So maybe, perhaps. We'll see how that develops. So fog of war, I think this is you could see how if you're not specific and deliberate with what these numbers mean and comparing apples to apples and oranges to oranges, that you can captivate information to support your narrative almost ad hoc with whatever you want. You could take the case mortality rate, fatality rate. You could take the infection fatality rate, and you could package your prior belief and your going forward, your cause cloaked behind that number and use that number to justify it. As Scott Adams talks about, and I give a lot of credit to some of my recent thinking to him, books like How to Fail at Nearly Everything and Still Win Big, Win Bigly about the 2016 election. Highly recommend that book. It's a fascinating read. He says that what we do is we choose what we believe, and then the information that we come in just starts to justify what we believe. That's how our brains work, is we believe something, and then the information we have come in is just excuses to believe that. And we'd like to think that we are rationally taking information coming in, and that's what's causal on what we believe. And that's in fact not likely. That's the exception rather than the rule. Most of us have concluded what we think, and then information we have coming in just becomes excuses and more substantiating evidence for why we think the way we do. So, so I think we're still in a fog of war with COVID-19 in terms of what these antibody tests means. Also, there's a really interesting article, and I don't think I pulled it up, but I don't think I did. But there's a great bit that I saw. I can't remember where I read it, that talked about, let's see if I have it up on my screen here, just in case I inadvertently, okay. Nope, I don't think I did it, unfortunately. Oh, maybe this is it. I'm not going to be able to find the exact quote, sadly, because I don't think I actually saved it, but bear with me, guys. Nope. Okay, I don't have it, sadly. Okay, but basically what it said is that there's been some suggestions. Okay, what if we don't have a vaccine? What if we don't have a viable treatment? What if the infection mortality rate is what it is, and the case fatality rate as we test more is going to drop, presumably as we get more tests rolled out. So what then? How long are we willing to stay at home? How long are we willing to crush the economy in that environment? And that's, when this was pointed out, the critique was that we're not hearing a public dialogue about that. Now, obviously, optimism is important, and we want to go into this, and Americans are optimistic by nature. So we want to go into this optimistically. But if what we got is what we got, we need to think about under what circumstances would we be reopening in a smart way that is respectful of the people who are most vulnerable, but doesn't sacrifice our economy more than it needs to be sacrificed. So I wish I had the quote. I apologize. Thanks for bearing with me for me to look it up. I don't have it. So that's the COVID stuff. I do want to talk about censorship a little bit. So I talked about the Helite video getting taken off of YouTube, which is this viable Cedars-Sinai partnership UV lighting system that goes down the trachea, and they're trying to do tests to see if it will kill viruses and bacteria inside the body. And so this was information that seemed Trump was aware of last Thursday at his press conference. And, he fumbled over the disinfectant and injection word versus ingestion. So, of course, the left went crazy about this. So anyway, the company at issue actually made a YouTube video to educate the public, and then YouTube removed it, and Twitter took their account down. And this is a legitimate company. That's strange. And then there's these two doctors. You may have seen these guys out in California who did an hour-long presentation on where the science is and were advocating opening up. That video got taken down. Now, there's been a lot of criticism of the doctors and that they were doing misinformation, but shouldn't that conversation can happen in the context of this video? I mean, you can have that in the comments. You can have counter videos that you make. In other words, why suppress information that might raise awareness and cause some back and forth discussion? So this two doctor video got taken down by social media. It's just, I understand that if there's what's perceived as dangerous information getting let out to the public, that you want to be careful of that. But I'm not sure what rises in these cases as dangerous information. A UV device from a viable company, startup company, working with Cedars-Sinai Medical Facility out of Los Angeles. And by the way, I used to know a researcher at Cedars-Sinai in Los Angeles. I should ask her about this. But so, is that harmful information? No, it just kind of shows that Trump sort of knew what he's talking about, and even though he butchered the way he said it and shouldn't have been brainstorming in public. But I'm not sure this is the best time to be doing these kind of editorializing decisions. And this is an interesting thing with YouTube and Twitter and Facebook and others, is if they start monitoring this content, they're no longer a platform, they're a publisher. And there's a legal distinction between a platform and a publisher. People like Ben Shapiro point this out quite a bit, that if you're a publisher, then that opens you up to libel laws and to suits, to lawsuits. If you're a platform, then and you do the free speech thing, like, hey, to each his own, then you're not opening yourself up to that. So I think they're walking a fine line with this publisher, versus their terms of service and whatnot. So they're walking a fine line, and I think it's going to blow up potentially in their face. And Twitter either deactivated account or did something with this account called Educating Liberals. And that was an account I followed because he actually has really thought-provoking posts. So he did a video telling the Twitter sphere that he got banned by Twitter and asking Jack what was going on. And then he actually suggested a class action lawsuit that he would be the front man for, and made this publisher platform distinction in that video. So that's Educating Liberals. If you guys want to go look that up, I'm sure you could Google it. But this censorship thing is troubling. I don't know if I like it. Now, it's not censorship that you can't find the information because there's other sources that you can go to, but most people don't know that. They got to know where to look. They got to go find out where it is. And so it's an interesting development. We'll keep our eyes on it. And then Trump thankfully declared the meat processing plants a critical infrastructure, and thereby allowing some emergency, presumably funds and powers to keep those meatpacking processing plants open. Yesterday, Tyson announced that they were closing down some plants and all these animals were going to be euthanized because there just wasn't the capacity to process them. So that kind of sent some shock waves. We don't want our supply chain to start breaking down. Things could get a lot worse than they are right now. And trust me, no one wants that. Okay. You on the left who want us to stay locked down through the end of the summer, you don't want that. That's not going to look good. Instead, we should be opening up. That's my view. I said that publicly yesterday. We should be opening up smartly, still with mitigation of those most vulnerable, and get out there and re-engage our economy, because the cure is starting to get worse than the disease, in my view. Moving on to politics, just 3 topics real quick. Kanye West achieved billionaire status. So that just came out over the weekend. And there's a New York Post piece that covered Kanye at an event that basically urges black Americans not to vote Democrat. I just thought this was really funny. And the quote was, "Own your power. Your power is not to just vote Democrat for the rest of your lives. That's not the power." And then he added, "The power is when I talked to my lawyer. I put on a trench coat and I said, 'We're moving these factories to America, and that's how it's going to be. And it's lovely.'" So Kanye, in his typical flashy way, was saying that in this interview. And there's a link to an earlier article where he was interviewed, I think, by World News Daily. And this was back in 2019, back in October. And the title is Kanye West, Democrats Making Blacks Abort Their Children. So, of course, nothing like a quote from Kanye to trigger people. But the subtitle is a quote from him. "We're brainwashed out there, bro. Come on, man." And then the quote from this that I wanted to highlight was, which I think is the most true thing about race relations in the U.S. And he said, quote, "The most racist thing a person can tell me is that I'm supposed to choose something based on my race." I'll repeat it. "The most racist thing a person can tell me is that I'm supposed to choose something based on my race." That something could be who to vote for, what position to support. And this is a really subtle, powerful critique against the Uncle Tom arguments for Larry Elder and Thomas Sowell and Candace Owens and these black conservatives and intellectuals who've come out in the public space over the last few years and are trying, in the case of Candace Owens, trying to lead this Blexit movement, hashtag Blexit, kind of like Brexit, play on Brexit from a few years ago. And that's a black exit from the Democratic Party. And then Dinesh D'Souza came out with his Death of a Nation a few years back. It was a book and a film. And it's a fascinating look at history. And it really analyzes race relations from the Civil War on in a way you probably have not seen before. And I'm not making a statement that it's true or false. I'm just saying that narrative, that story, you've probably never been exposed to. And for some of you, if you go back and research that Death of a Nation, it's going to cause some cognitive dissonance. It's going to make you push back because it challenges your narrative. I know it did with me. So I thought I'd cover Kanye with that. I think that's great. If I think it was over 90% voted, 90% of the black demographic voted for Hillary Clinton, and it's been over 90% for a while. And so I think if that drops down to, let's say, 80% or 75%, the Democrats are in real trouble. And there's some polling a while back that suggested Republican favorability amongst minorities, including blacks, was up around 30% of those minority communities. That's pretty awesome in my view, because we need more diversity of opinion. Diversity of skin color, I get. That's in our face every day. But what about diversity of opinion, diversity of viewpoint, diversity of perspective? Okay, so that's Kanye. Michael Flynn. I wanted to cover this because I've been covering the IG Horowitz stuff coming out. This is another development. And this one's really troubling. So there's 2 pieces, one from the Federalist, which is that guy who's under investigation now, and one from National Review from a great writer, Andrew McCarthy, sorry. So I want to read the National Review piece first. So last Friday evening, the Justice Department belatedly disclosed exculpatory information indicating, reportedly, that there was no valid law enforcement reason for the FBI to interview Flynn in January 2017, and that he later pled guilty under the threat that if he did not do so, prosecutors would charge his son with a crime, an understanding that was withheld from the court at the time of the guilty plea. In making the disclosure, the Justice Department signaled that more disclosures about the case are forthcoming. So that's in the National Review, and I guess Andrew McCarthy wrote a book on this called Ball of Collusion, The Plot to Rig and Election and Destroy a Presidency. Plot to Rig and Election and Destroy a Presidency. That was published in August of last year. So I might have to pick up that book. So that's what Andrew McCarthy said. And then over in the Federalist, it goes through basically three things. The first is that Michael Flynn, General Flynn, basically took away his guilty plea. So he withdraws his guilty plea. That's fact number one. Fact number two is the federal prosecutor sidestepped legal requirements. And the quote from Flynn's lawyer was, the government, quote, the government produced to Mr. Flynn stunning Brady evidence that proves Mr. Flynn's allegations of having been deliberately set up and framed by corrupt agents at the top of the FBI. It also defeats any argument that the interview of Mr. Flynn on January 24th, 2017 was material to any investigation, Flynn's attorney wrote. So that's fact number two. And then fact number three in this Federalist article is relating to the basically the deal, the threat of prosecution of Flynn's son if he did not plead guilty. So it basically seemed to be a threat targeting his son, and that's very unusual in any kind of agreement for a plea bargain. Threatening a person's family member is kind of, I guess, let me see if I can read this. When a defendant cuts a deal with the government and agrees to cooperate and testify against a co-defendant or others under Giglia, which is case law, those other defendants are entitled to learn the benefit of the plea agreement. But the email excerpts above suggest, as Powell argued in her latest filing, that the lead prosecutor, Van Grack, quote, made a side deal not to prosecute General Michael Flynn as a material term of the plea agreement, but he required that it be kept secret between himself and the Covington attorneys expressly to avoid the requirement of Giglio. So it seems like this agreement was kept secret, which is unusual. Usually in a plea agreement, the reason would be known. So we'll see. We should track the story. I think General Flynn is going to get off. And I think that, not get off, I think he's going to turn this on them. And good for him. Good for him. It seems to be falsely accused, threatened by bully tactics from the FBI. And that should be troubling to all of us because that violates due process. That violates our constitutional rights. So keep an eye on that. The Flynn case about to implode, according to the Federalist. And then I want to end, where am I at? Just over an hour. So the VP dilemma, who to pick for VP. And so in the military, we have this term horns of a dilemma. And this is this combined arms concept. What is combined arms? Combined arms is you got ground forces attacking with their ground machines, and you've got indirect fire attacking with its capabilities like artillery or rockets or something. And then you've got aviation attacking with their assets. So you've got like these three axes of attack, and it's putting the enemy in a horns of a dilemma, which means they can't maneuver this direction because that exposes them to attack by air, and they can't pivot to this direction because that attack exposes them to attack by indirect fire. And if they go this way, they run into the ground forces. So that's presenting the enemy with a no-win scenario, and that is a warfighting concept. Clausewitz and others, you want to try to put your enemy into a no-win situation. And it seems that without intent, this is what's happening with the Democratic VP shakeup and who's going to be selected for VP. Why do I say that? Because there's no good choice. No good choice of the candidates or of the nominees or the potential VP folks. They don't have a good choice because if they come out, first of all, it's mostly women. He's mentioned he wants it to be a woman. So they come out in support of Joe Biden in light of these Tara Reade allegations, these sexual allegations. And they've said anything in the past about Brett Kavanaugh and Christine Blasey Ford, of which they've said a lot that's been documented, and I'll cover that in a second. Then that's the ad, because presumably the VP candidate, the VP nominee, could take over the ticket when Joe Biden's moral decline or cognitive decline gets further along and further accelerated. So Amy Klobuchar, Kamala Harris, Stacey Abrams, Gretchen, what's her face from Michigan. So those are potential ones. But the thing is at least if you've been in the Senate, Elizabeth Warren too, if you've been in the Senate, or if you were Stacey Abrams, there's public tweets about Christine Blasey Ford. So the hypocrisy is just going to be out of this world. And that's just going to be the campaign ads from here until November, if they become the top of the ticket. So I call this the Horns Dilemma, and there's two articles to sustain this point of view. And I'll cover those here when I open up my iPad. One comes from The Spectator. And I mentioned yesterday, Tom Cotton, as reported by Fox News, was asking why senators who believed Christine Blasey Ford would consider running with Joe Biden after Tara Reade's credible allegation. Just a question, just a simple question. Well, now a lady in The Spectator, and I love this, she, her name's Amber Athay, and I saw her tweet come by my thread last night when I was reading. So let me just read a little bit of this. So the reason this is so important is because just in the last 24 hours, it broke that Tara Reade told a neighbor about this event, a neighbor a few years later, and this neighbor has come out publicly. This neighbor's name is Linda LaCase, and recalls when Tara Reade confided in her about this experience when they were, socializing after work. They were neighbors in the same apartment complex. So she corroborates the story, that she, heard about it and was confided in. So Tara Reade, a former Senate staffer for Joe Biden, claimed in an interview last month that the former vice president had put his hand up her skirt and digitally penetrated her in 1993. Since the March 25th interview, new evidence has emerged that seems to corroborate Reade's story. Her mother called Larry King's radio show about the incident in 1993, and her brother, a friend, and neighbor all recall being told the story by Reade. Nonetheless, despite making multiple media appearances in the month since the allegation, Biden has not addressed Reade's claim directly, though his spokesman people have denied it on his behalf. The former VP is nonetheless holding a virtual women's town hall on Tuesday. Biden, who's a presumptive Democratic nominee, has also enjoyed numerous high-profile endorsements since Reade came forward, including House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and former President Barack Obama. The Spectator has compiled a list of 35 endorsements alongside their previous positions on sexual assault, supporting alleged victims. Quote, hashtag Believe Women and hashtag MeToo. So I'm just going to go through some of the names. Speaker Pelosi, Pramila Jayapal, endorsed April 27th. Mark Warner endorsed Biden April 23rd. Governor Jay Inslee endorsed Biden April 22nd. Representative Gwen Moore endorsed Biden on April 22nd. Representative Sherry Bustis endorsed on April 20th. Representative Catherine Clark, April 20th. Barbara Lee, April 20th. Ro Khanna, April 20th. Andy Levin, April 20th. Jamie Raskin, April 20th. Jim McGovern, April 20th. Near and dear to my heart, and I actually tweeted about this last night, Senator Mazie Hirono from my state of Hawaii endorsed Biden on April 18th. Let me read one of her tweets. It took a lot of courage for Christine Blasey Ford to come forward to share her story of sexual assault by Brett Kavanaugh. Her story is very credible, and I believe her. So that's her. Senator Brian Schatz, also from Hawaii, endorsed Biden on April 17th. Keep in mind, this story broke March 25th. March 25th. So they're endorsing Biden, what is that, 3 weeks, a little over 3 weeks from the breaking of the story. And this is what Brian Schatz says. Quote, the game that some R's are running is if legally there is reasonable doubt about the sexual assault allegations, then Brett Kavanaugh should be confirmed. That's upside down. This is not a criminal proceeding, and the Senate is not deciding whether or not to throw him in jail. We are deciding whether or not to give him a super powerful job for life. He gets fairness, but not an evidentiary standard, as if his personal freedom is at stake. It is not. So that was Brian Schatz's view on Christine Blasey Ford and the Brett Kavanaugh situation. Tara Reade. Now, one of the, I think it was the, I don't know if it was the Federalist or somebody reported that they reached out to all of the, I think it was the Federalist, reached out to all of these endorsements, and they reached out to all the people who've endorsed Biden and asked them if they would comment on Tara Reade. And I think they were reporting at the time that there's only like 3 or 4 who had commented on Tara Reade publicly. And one of them was Amy Klobuchar. And no one got back to the Federalist. It might have been another news agency. I'm trying to remember. So this is the horns of a dilemma, because if a woman becomes a VP nominee and has endorsed Biden and isn't saying a lot publicly about the Tara Reade allegation, then there's going to be some tough explaining to do, in my view. I think that the right is not going to let this issue go down without a fight. And Tara Reade, as compared to Christine Blasey Ford, has 3 or 4 pieces of corroboration near to the event that Christine Blasey Ford did not. So that's the distinction between the two cases. So there's another piece by The Cut, which is looks like a more liberal publication. I'm not really that familiar with it. So this a quote in there, by putting themselves forward as subsidiaries to Biden in accepting an invitation that he might extend, or even in voicing their support for his campaign, these women wind up imperiling themselves by getting tied to him and the mess of his historical shortcomings, often on exactly the issues that have driven them into politics. In fact, they are quite likely to have their own history of righteous advocacy held up against them, used to make them look like hypocrites for agreeing to be on a ticket with a man who has been credibly accused of behavior they have aggressively condemned, and as sops to a system that they are in fact working hard to change. This is an article from The Cut, and boy, that's a harsh way to put it. And this is by Rebecca Traister in The Cut. And the title of this is called The Biden Trap. As candidate faces credible assault allegations, his progressive female colleagues are being offered a poisoned chalice. And this is that horns of a dilemma, no good way to go to get out of this. Now, presumably they'll get out of this the best way they can, or try to get out of it. And we'll see if what the political maneuvering is. And it'll be interesting to see if they actually do escape it and the electorate allows them to, and certainly they might do that. The Democrats might coalesce around a female candidate at the top of the ticket after this all plays out. So we'll see. But I hope that's it. That's all I want to talk about. A little over an hour. Hopefully I gave you some good material to think about and consider. I'm hoping to help round you out in your awareness about the way things are, and to consider some things that you may not have been aware of before that might help to update your narrative and update your thinking about topics, issues, or people. That's all for now. I am Joel Van Brunt. This is The Brunt of It, and I will see you guys later.